We need Officer Bob. Where is Officer Bob? Come on, Officer Bob. Is Officer Bob coming?
Is Officer Bob on his way?
Dispatch to Officer Bob. Dispatch to Officer Bob. Please respond.
Officer Bob's here.
Hi kids, Officer Bob here. I'm honored to be invited as a guest reader for the Warwick, Rhode Island Police Department. The Warwick, Rhode Island Police Department is a great organization with absolutely wonderful officers, and they're there to help you in a time of need. The police are there to keep you safe and protected in the event of an emergency. Don't ever be afraid to call the police if you need help. The Adventures of Officer Bob on Patrol by G.S. White. That's me, Officer Bob. And illustrated by Leanna Connolly, an incredible illustrator. It is a beautiful morning in a lovely little place called Dillington Borough. The sun was rising and had begun to shine brightly. The temperature was nearly perfect, and there was a wonderful aroma of morning dew in the air. Everyone seemed to be more chipper than usual, including the birds and animals. Dillington Borough and its people were safe and well protected because Police Officer Robert T. Billingsworth III and his animal friends were on patrol. Officer Robert T. Billingsworth III, Officer Bob for short, started the day with his daily patrol checks. He drove his fancy police cruiser down tree-lined Main Street to check on Miss Lily Little People's daycare. Mortimer also liked to tag along. "Hello, Miss Lily. How are you today? Is everything okay with the children?" Officer Bob inquired from his car window. "I'm fine, and everything is well with the children. Thank you for asking," replied Miss Lily. After visiting for a while, the nice officer waved goodbye to Miss Lily and the children. He continued to patrol down Main Street to check on Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson's hardware store had almost been robbed several months before, if not for Officer Bob and friends. "Hello, Mr. Johnson. How are you in the store today?" asked Officer Bob. "We're doing fine," replied Mr. Johnson. Then he kindly asked, "Officer Bob, how is your family?" "My family is doing well, and the stork is soon to arrive with a special delivery," chuckled Officer Bob. He continued to enjoy his patrol through the tree-lined streets as he headed back toward the end of town. He passed several little stores, a gas station, a bank, a post office, and his favorite lunch spot, Antonio's Pizzeria. Officer Bob's stomach started to grumble as he passed the pizzeria. He was hungry even though it was still morning, and he had just eaten his breakfast. He had a good appetite. He loved his meal times and always looked forward to the next one. However, it was not time for his break. He had work to do. Officer Bob then drove his fancy police cruiser to Miss Daisy's flower shop. This was his last patrol check for the morning. It was located at the very end of town and was his favorite stop, even more than the pizzeria. Every Friday afternoon, Officer Bob would buy a bouquet of flowers for his wonderful wife. This was his way of thanking her for understanding and supporting him being a police officer and his desire to keep all of Dillington Borough safe and protected. She knew that being a police officer was a dangerous and demanding job. Seeing that Miss Daisy was busy tending to her store, Officer Bob decided to head back to Dillington Borough Police Headquarters. He liked to be there to greet his police chief every morning. Police Chief Mahoney was very important to Officer Bob. Chief Mahoney was in charge of the police department and had been like a father to Officer Bob ever since his first nervous day on the police force. They always met for coffee at the Dillington Police Headquarters to discuss the day's events and decide how to keep the town safe. The radio squealed. Dispatched to Officer Bob. The radio squealed again. Dispatched to Officer Bob, squawked the police radio. Report to 125 North Main Street. An elderly woman is feeling ill from a bee sting. Repeat, report to 125 North Main Street. An elderly woman is feeling ill from a bee sting. Officer Bob and animal friends rushed from headquarters to the fancy police cruiser. Officer Bob immediately turned on his police lights and police siren. He pointed his fancy police cruiser in the direction of the woman's house and spun off. Mortimer held on tight. Mrs. Moore, who often made him the most incredible chocolate chip cookies, lived there. He knew she was allergic to bee stings and that it could be very serious. He drove as quickly and carefully as he could, finally reaching 125 North Main Street. He arrived at the same time as the ambulance. He sure was happy to see his old friend Medic Max with the squad. Thinking fast, Officer Bob and Medic Max jumped into action. They had to work quickly to help Mrs. Moore, who was beginning to have problems breathing. She held her hand to her throat. It was swelling quickly due to the bee sting. She could not breathe. Officer Bob and Medic Max used an emergency allergy shot to stop her allergic reaction. It worked! Mrs. Moore began to feel better. She was able to breathe and swallow again. She smiled and patted Officer Bob on his cheek. I knew you would come. Thank you, Officer Bob. The squad put Mrs. Moore into the ambulance to take her to the hospital so that a doctor could check her. Officer Bob, Medic Max, and the animals were happy that she was all right. At that very moment, Officer Bob realized how much he likes being a police officer. He really enjoys protecting the people of Dillington Borough and their property. Officer Bob thinks of Mrs. Moore and the whole town as his family. They are very important to him. He cares for them all and never wants the children or anyone else to be afraid of asking him for help. Officer Bob then jumped back into his fancy police cruiser and radioed to report that the situation at 125 North Main Street is now clear. The relieved officers started to drive toward the Dillington Borough Police Headquarters to fill out the police report when the radio squealed. Dispatched Officer Bob. The radio squealed. Dispatched Officer Bob, squawked the police radio. Report to 65 East State Street for a... Well then, Officer Bob smiled and thought, I guess that coffee with Chief Mahoney will just have to wait. The end. I hope you enjoyed my story, The Adventures of Officer Bob on Patrol, and thank you for listening. Remember, the Warwick, Rhode Island Police Department, firefighters, and ambulance people care about you. You are special. So until next time, always be kind to others, always be aware of your surroundings, and always stay safe. I'll see you soon.